Go ahead and open up your Bibles. Today we're going to be in Isaiah chapter 6. It's the prophet Isaiah chapter 6. Now, I want to start off asking you a question. If I asked you to define God, and you could only use one word, what do you think would be the best way to define God? And if you already looked in the bulletin and saw the title of the sermon, you're cheating and you don't get to answer. What is the best way that we have to define God? Even if you have looked at the title already, what would you have said had you not? Well, some people might say maybe God is love. Love is the best way to define God. Some people might say He's good. You might even say God is limitless. Well, lately we've been studying how to grow closer to God just simply by knowing God, by understanding Him better. So we've just been trying just to learn about God. We looked at, First week we looked at how God is limitless. He's beyond our understanding. We can't comprehend Him. The second week we looked at how God, even though He's beyond what we can understand, He's revealed Himself to us somehow for us to know Him. And now today I want to look at what I think is probably the best description of God given in the Bible. And that is that God is holy. Now in Isaiah 6, starting in verse 1, we see a vision that Isaiah has while he's in the temple. It tells us in verse 1, "In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord seated on a throne, high and exalted, and the train of His robe filled the temple. Above Him were seraphs, each with 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they were flying. And they were calling to one another, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of His glory." At the sound of their voices, the doorposts and thresholds shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. "Woe to me," I cried, "I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty." Then one of the seraphs flew to me with a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with tongs from the altar. With it he touched my mouth and said, "See, this has touched your lips, your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for." Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, "Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" And I said, "Here am I, send me." What I think this passage tells us about God and Isaiah's vision of God, the one trait about God that just shines forth in the midst of everything else, is that above all things, God is holy. But we have to ask the question, what does holiness mean? So often we say, God is holy, but we just assume, well, whatever that means, He is it. But there must be more to it. There must be some understanding we can have of holiness. Well, today, by looking at this passage I just read, I want to look at a couple of characteristics of holiness, a couple of traits that we find in God simply because He is holy. Well, if we look back through it, through the first few verses, let's look at the first thing that we see that really paints a picture of God's holiness. The first few verses, we have Isaiah in the temple. He has this vision of God. He says that he sees God high and lifted up. He's high and exalted. In other words, He's above all things. And while He's up here sitting on this throne where the train of His robe fills the whole temple, He sees these angels, these seraphs that are flying around, and they're singing, just proclaiming the holiness of God. This paints a picture, first off, of God's transcendence. God's holiness means that He is transcendent. To be transcendent is just to be above and beyond things. Isaiah sees this miraculous picture of God in the temple and how He's high and exalted, and there are seraphs flying around. Now we may stop and say, well, what's a seraph? Well, apparently a seraph is an angel, and apparently it has 6 wings, and, well, that's pretty much all we know about it. Isaiah seems to act here like this is the kind of thing he maybe knew something about beforehand. He already had an idea of what a seraph is, and he sort of assumes his readers know what he knows, and if we don't know everything he knows, we just don't know everything he knows. But the seraphs are angels, and God is so high, so exalted, that He has these angels flying around Him that are just proclaiming how holy He is. And when they speak, the temple shakes and it's filled with smoke. This is the real transcendence of God. So what is transcendence? Well, first off, transcendence means to be above and beyond. You transcend something, you go beyond it. In the military, oftentimes, they will honor a soldier by saying that he goes above and beyond the call of duty. Technically, you could say he transcended his call of duty. You see, God is above and beyond all things because He is holy. Psalm 95:3 says, "For the Lord is the great God, the great King above all gods. He's above everything. Now that verse is not trying to promote polytheism, but simply the author of that verse is just looking at the culture surrounding him, realizing all these other people believe in gods, and when they go to war, they think it's my God against your God. If my God wins, that means, if we win, that means my God was better. But he's even saying, hey, even if that is true, which it's not, even if it is true, all throughout history, God has proven that He is above all things. You see, God is beyond the common. He is transcendent. We see a picture of God's transcendence in 2 Samuel chapter 6. In this part, in 2 Samuel, David has decided to bring the Ark of the Covenant, which represents the presence of God, into the capital city, Jerusalem. And so some guys go and get it. They don't do it the way they're supposed to, but they put it on the back of a cart, and they're taking it in. And in 2 Samuel 6, verse 6, it says, when they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah reached out and took hold of the ark of God because the oxen stumbled. The Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of his irreverent act. Therefore, God struck him down, and he died there beside the ark. Now, we read that verse, and we oftentimes think, well, that seems a little harsh. All he did was reach out and steady it. It was probably wobbling a little bit. But what we don't realize is that Uzzah did something wrong. You see, he looked at this ark of God, this thing that represented the very presence of God, this holy presence right there with him, this transcendent thing, and he thought, oh, it's just like anything else. It's something I could just reach out and touch. It's like if I was hauling a big bale of hay on the back of my wagon, and it shook a little bit, so I steadied. I could just reach out and touch it like I could that. But you see, God is beyond that. God is above all things. He is transcendent. He's so transcendent. He's so far above everything that angels fly around proclaiming how great He is. So also I would add to that, not just being above and beyond, but God's transcendence means that He is separate. He's set apart. And part of transcendence, being closely related to being above and beyond, is to be separate. God is apart from all things. In other words, nothing can compare with God. Isaiah 40, verse 18, says, to whom then will you compare God? What image will you compare Him to? And the understood answer is nothing. You can't compare anything to God. You see, God is separate. He's separate from us. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't know Him and we can't relate to Him in any way. It simply means there is nothing beside God, nothing that you can even put close to Him. Deuteronomy 4:39 says, acknowledge and take to heart this day that the Lord is God in heaven above and on earth below. There is no other. Nothing else even stands in comparison to God. He is separate from all things because He is holy. Let me ask you a question. And I'm pretty sure nobody in here has ever thought of this before. Maybe you have. If you have, tell me after the sermon, because I want to know if other people are thinking like me. But have you ever wondered why, when we get together and eat as a church, we have this table up here on the back of the fellowship hall. We put all of the salads and the meats and everything like that. But then on the opposite side, on its own special table, we put the desserts. You ever wondered why we do that? I think I probably know why we do that. I think because deep back in the back of our mind somewhere, we know that dessert is a holy thing. We know that it is sacred, and we know that it is the greatest part of the entire meal. It's our favorite part. It's the part that we save for last. It's the part we go back for seconds and thirds and fourths and fifths. And so something about its nature demands that it be set apart. It's all on its own table by itself because it is holy to us. Or at least maybe we treat it that way. You see, something that is holy demands to be set apart from the rest. It's different from everything else. You see, God is above and beyond and separate from us and everything, not just in His limitlessness, not just in His power, but just in His very nature. Part of God being holy is the fact that He is just beyond everything. Nothing can compare. And there's something special about Him that sets Him apart from the rest. You know, once a week, Bree and I try to make it a habit that we have a date night. And now date night, technically speaking, is a holy thing for us, because we set it aside from all the other nights of the week. We don't normally, go out to eat every night of the week. We will maybe a few times, but we always make it a point to try to go out to eat on date night. We always try to make it a point to just get away from everything else, just go out and just relax and just enjoy spending our time together, enjoy having a nice meal. I think it's a good thing to do. It's a good practice to have. But you see, the anticipation of that, the practice of that, that sets that one night of the week apart from all the other nights. It's a special night. You could say it's maybe a transcendent night. It transcends the other nights. It's a holy night because it's something special to us. You see, God is holy, and that means He is above and beyond and separate from all other things. Nehemiah 9:5 says, "Blessed be your glorious name, and may it be exalted above all blessing and praise." Now, when they say, "Blessed be your glorious name," it's just saying we want to honor and praise your name. We want to praise it above all other praises, all other glorious things. Your name is first. So here, I'll tell you this. If God really is above and beyond all things, He deserves to be praised like He is above and beyond all things. The fact is, He's not just a God who deserves to be praised once a week. He's not a God who only deserves to be praised when we don't have anything better to do. He's not a God who only deserves to be praised when we have a half-hearted idea of it or when we feel sort of like praising Him. You see, God transcends all things. He is above all things, and He deserves to be praised above all things. God's holiness means transcendence. Let's look at one more factor, one more characteristic of God's holiness here given in this chapter, in this account of Isaiah's vision. In Isaiah 6, verse 5, once Isaiah is in the temple and he has this vision and he sees God and sees the angels and he realizes what's going on, he says in verse 5, "Woe to me, I cried. I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty." Now, the thing that this points out about God's holiness is His purity. When Isaiah is here in the presence of God, the very first thing he realizes is his own sinfulness. Now here he specifically speaks of the sinfulness of his lips, probably referring to his speech or something like that. We find out later there's a reason he speaks specifically of that, because God is commissioning him to speak for him, so his speech must be pure. But for some reason, and we see this all throughout the Bible, whenever people find themselves in the very presence of God, that is always seems to them to be reason for them to die. When people walk away from seeing God, they seem to be surprised that they live. For example, in Genesis 32, verse 30, Jacob saw God, and he said, "I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." He was surprised that somehow he lived when he was in the presence of God. And this is the only reason I can account for that. When man is in the presence of God, his own sin becomes immensely evident because of God's purity. God is so holy, He is so pure, that when compared with Him, our impurity is just completely obvious. Part of God's holiness is His purity. So we may have to address, what exactly is purity? Well, purity is to be completely whole. It's consistent. It's without any sort of imperfection at all. And God is most certainly pure. We're told in 1 John 1:5, "This is the message we have heard from Him and declare to you. God is light. In Him there is no darkness at all." In other words, nothing contaminates God. Nothing. He's completely devoid of sin and of wrong and of imperfection. And that's why it's such a big deal for Isaiah, who's this imperfect, flawed person, to stand in the presence of God, because he realizes right here you have the absolute sheer perfection, complete total purity, and then right there next to it in Isaiah you have imperfection. And they don't belong together. They don't deserve to be near each other. Now God fixes that in this story by forgiving Isaiah of his sins. He makes him pure. But any contaminant at all means that there is no purity. Let me ask you a hypothetical question. If you were sitting at a church meal, we were all eating together, and somebody, I don't know who, let's say Ron, walks by, and you're sitting there with your glass of Coke, and he walks by, and for some reason, he just walks by and sticks his finger in your glass of Coke, and then walks away. Are you going to finish that drink? That's what I want to know. If you're normal, I think you're going to say, no, you're not going to finish that drink. If you would, then you're not like me, so I assume you're not normal. But if you're not going to finish that drink, why wouldn't you? I mean, granted, he has a little bit of dirt on his finger. Maybe there's some germs that got off into your drink. But when you compare the amount of contaminant to the actual amount of Coke in that glass, it's minuscule. The ratio of germs to Coke is hardly any at all. So you don't want to drink it? Well, it doesn't matter. It is still contaminated. It's still impure. There's still something wrong with it. See, to be holy is to be pure. Isaiah 5:16 says, "But the Lord Almighty will be exalted by His justice, and the holy God will show Himself holy by His righteousness." God's very nature, His very righteousness, His goodness, the fact that He's just without corruption, that is what makes Him pure. And I want you to understand, it is immensely important that we understand this aspect of God. Because if we don't understand this, we're not going to have a very good understanding of God. You see, if you ask most people today, in a postmodern society, Christians and non-Christians alike, you ask them to describe God, most people will probably say something along the lines of, God is love. And that's true. That's biblical. That's right. However, if that's the only thing a person understands about God, their understanding is lacking. You see, we have to understand more about God than that He is love. It's so true that He's love. But if your very basis for understanding Him is that He is love, and that's it, then there's a lot of things you're not going to get. You're not going to be able to understand how a loving God could allow people to go to hell. You're not going to be able to understand, if all you know is that God is love, you're not going to be able to understand how a loving God could punish or discipline people. And you're not going to be able to understand how a loving God could look at someone and say, "Away from me, I never knew you." But when you understand that above all things God is holy, and that means that He is pure, then you know that impurity, sin, cannot be with Him. His absolute pure presence cannot tolerate sin. It's completely contrary to Him. And that's why people who are still guilty of their sins may not be in the presence of God for eternity. You see, above all things, God is holy. He is pure, and we have to understand this. Now, part of what it means to say, at least, that God is holy is that He is pure. He's also transcendent, and there's probably more things that we could add to that. But, you know, we don't always recognize purity as we should. We tend to think, as people, if something is mostly pure, well, then it's pretty much pure. But really, any imperfection means it's not pure. I think I can understand how we think that. There's not many things in our world that really are completely 100% pure. There's a brand of water filtration device called Pure Filters. Their name is Pure. Now, when you run water through their filter, is it really coming out pure? Real water is two hydrogen atoms to one oxygen atom. Are you really getting nothing but two hydrogen atoms and one oxygen atom when you run something through a water filter? Well, you'll get just a few more things, not much. It's mostly pure, but there'll be a few more things in it. You may have some calcium. You may have some magnesium. You may have some carbon dioxide or some sulfate or some chloride or some nitrate or fluoride or sodium or silica or iron or magnesium or aluminum or oxygen or hydrogen sulfide or ammonia. You may have a little bit of that in there, but for the most part, it's pure, right? That's our understanding of pure. As long as it's within a certain range, we consider it pure. But you see, those are just things that are just found in fresh water. It's not even completely pure on its own. See, we don't have many things that are really pure, and so we tend to think if it's mostly pure, then it's pure. It's natural for us to think that, for example, anything that is a sexual sin, it's okay as long as it's only in our mind. If it's not expressed in our actions, then it's not entirely unpure, so it's mostly pure, so still we're pretty much pure. Christ taught the opposite of that. He said that the sin of lust is just as bad as the sin of adultery. We think, oh, well, if, I have hatred in my mind, as long as it's all expressed only in my thoughts and not in my actions, then I'm still pretty much pure. Christ taught the opposite of that as well. You see, to be pure is to be completely without impurity at all. So God is completely pure. He is holy. But is there anything else to that? Well, 1 Peter 1:14 says, "As obedient children, do not conform to the evil desires you had when you lived in ignorance, but just as He who called you is holy, so be holy in all you do. For it is written, 'Be holy, because I am holy.'" At least 5 times in the Bible, the people of God are referred to as a whole and told to be holy because God is holy. Now that means something special. First off, that means that we are special because we are to be pure and holy because God is. Because we are His. He intends that for us. Really, God has set a goal for our lives, and we have a standard to live up to. That standard is something that we should be pursuing. To be absolutely, completely pure, we have to be realistic. Like we already said, if it's not completely pure, then it's not really pure. If there's any impurity at all, it's not pure. And to be completely realistic, we are not going to live up to God's perfect standards of purity. You are not going to live the rest of your life without any sin at all. Now that is where God's grace comes in, and that forgives us for where we lack. That's not meant to be used as something to cover over everything we don't feel like doing, but that's where we have tried and where we failed, and that's where God fixes us. But we are called to be, by our very nature, pure. Now, the Bible refers to Christians as saints. And that word that's translated saint in the Bible, very literally, is the same word translated holy. Literally, saint means holy one. Now, in the Old Testament, that word is used in the King James Version. I'm not sure if it's any other versions of the Bible, but it's the same word, kadesh in the Hebrew, is the same word meaning holy, or holy ones, or saints. You see, holiness means purity, and we are called to that. So above all things, everything else, God is holy. He's above, He's beyond, He's set apart from all things, He's absolutely pure. So I just have one question now. What should our response be to a holy God? Well, I think it should be the same as Isaiah's response. In this vision he has, once Isaiah is cleansed of his sins and once he's forgiven, God asks this question, whom shall I send and who will go for us? And I think this is kind of funny. The way I picture this in my mind, building up to it. God's asking this question. He knows the answer. Isaiah knows the answer. They both know what's going to happen. Makes me think of when a mom walks in to see her kids and says, who wants ice cream? And she knows what they're going to say, and they know what's going to happen, and they still get excited. They jump up and they say, ooh, I want ice cream. Please, give me ice cream. God says, whom shall I send? And I just picture Isaiah just in complete excitement, standing here having seen this transcendent, all-powerful God, this pure God who's just made him pure as well. He jumps up and he says, ooh, please, send me. I want to go. I want to represent you. And that should be our response to God. Here I am. Send me. Whatever you'd have of me, whatever you want me to do, just please send me. I want you to remember, above all things, God is holy.